Hello and welcome to our second video in our series of lectures for Philosophy of Mind, Lehman College, in our topic of property dualism. In this video, we're going to look at the two articles from Frank Jackson, Epiphenomenal Qualia, or Qualia, and a reply that Jackson made to some objections to his theory. So he calls himself, right at the very beginning of the article, a qualia freak. And what he means by this is him and other philosophers who think that physicalism, remember the theory that everything is made up of physical matter, leaves out part of the universe. Not just a perspective on the universe, but real knowledge of the way the universe works. And he tries to give a deductive argument as to why qualia or qualia is a problem for physicalism. He says, as a premise, nothing you could tell of a physical sort captures the smell of a rose. So again, this is someone who is this future amazing scientist who knows everything about biology, plant biology, animal biology, how they interact in time and in space. But you still couldn't deduct from all of that physical information the qualia, the experience of what a rose smells like. Therefore, physicalism leaves something out of its story and can't be true as it is. And when he says physical, he means everything physical, not just static objects made up of atoms that we can hold, touch, see, and smell. He means the functional systems of the functionalists. He means networks of neural connections like some other theorists, everything that's made up of physical matter. Even if we knew every single thing about it, we still wouldn't know what experience is like. And that's why he's a quote-unquote qualia freak. And he posits what he calls the knowledge argument to try and show why that previous deductive argument is true. If you don't recall from previous classes, a deductive argument has to be true if its premises are true. So premises are evidence, and if the premise, nothing you could tell of a physical sort captures the smell of a rose, is true, then it must be true that physicalism is false. So if you were going to argue against him, you would have to disprove his evidence. The argument itself is valid. So he's trying to prove that his evidence is true by giving us this thought experiment. He gives us the example of a man named Fred who can see vastly more colors than any human who has ever existed can see. Maybe he has more rods and cones, maybe he got some sort of a technological implant, but either way, he can consistently sort piles of objects into colors that he can see. We can't perceive them. And when we go and investigate it, we can see different physical structural differences in these objects. I think he uses tomatoes. So we give Fred a pile of tomatoes and he sorts them into different colors, whereas all we can see is the one color, maybe 2 or 3 shades of red. But he can do it very finely and minutely, and he says he sees them as separate colors, as drastically as we might see the difference between black and white or red and blue. He can see the differences in these tomatoes. And he does it accurately and he does it consistently. But just because we can test these tomatoes and see that the different density of their atoms reflect the light in a different way, there's absolutely no way that we can know about Fred's experience of these different colors. We know something less than Fred does. I have the picture here of a mantis shrimp, which is something in the real world that can see many more colors than we can, because they have way more rods and cones, the specialized visual cells in the eyes, than we do. And some estimates say they can see 1 million colors. So therefore, we could never know what their experience of color is like. We could never know about the shades of color that they know about. And Jackson says that Fred, our super seer, has more knowledge about the world than every single other person that's ever existed. Nobody knows what those extra colors look like. And he insists that his argument is different to Thomas Nagel's. Remember, we read What It's Like to Be a Bat? And he says Nagel is talking about being able to imagine what an experience is like, and that a cognitive capacity is not a fact. It doesn't count as something that should be available to physicalism. Because remember, if you're a physicalist, you think that all knowledge, all true and false things about the universe and the world and about our bodies and minds should be accessible as knowledge, as something we could prove or disprove. But imagining isn't like that, and that's what he thinks Nagel's trying to talk about when he says we can't imagine what it's like to be a bat. Now, it may seem to you when you're reading through this that Jackson's actually being kind of uncharitable toward Nagel, because Nagel explicitly points out that he thinks there are subjective facts of the matter, things that are true or false, and that qualia count as facts. If you wanted to focus on this comparison, like maybe for a paper or just to think it out in your head, you'd need to think about the difference between facts and knowledge on the one hand, and qualia and experience on the other. That's how I should have put this slide and didn't quite. But perhaps Jackson and Nagel do use the concepts of fact and knowledge in a different way. I'm going to leave that exercise up to you and move on to how Jackson argues for epiphenomenalism. He brings up 3 common objections to epiphenomenalism and then counter-argues against those objections. And the first major one is kind of saying, just get over it, guys, but in a lot more logical detail, saying that most of us don't want epiphenomenalism to be true because it doesn't really seem true. It seems like our thirst causes us to go get water. We want to have free will. We want to have agency and be able to make decisions in our lives. But just because we don't want epiphenomenalism to be true doesn't mean that it isn't. And here he is trying to say that you can be 2 levels of an epiphenomenalist. You can deny that qualia have causal efficacy, meaning that the way something feels or looks or tastes or smells is epiphenomenal. But that doesn't mean that you have to deny that all mental states are epiphenomenal. So we can have lots of other kinds of mental events. We can have pain, we can have desire, we can have intentionality where we set a goal and we want to go do something out in the world. And just because qualia have, or perhaps have, no causal power doesn't mean that all mental events or properties don't have mental power. You could be a strong epiphenomenalist and say that no mental properties have causal power and it's all just a byproduct. But you don't have to be an epiphenomenalist like that. So you could be one or the other, or neither really if you're not an epiphenomenalist. But if you are one, you could be one or the other, the weaker or the stronger. And you'll note that he talks about Hume and causation to try and go against the people who do not believe in epiphenomenalism. If you've never studied Hume and causation, we'll do a quick overview, very quick, leaving out a lot of details. Hume asks us why we come to think that physical event A causes physical event B. His stereotypical example is a billiard ball. When we strike the cue ball with our cue and it goes and it hits another ball, we think that the force we strike it with is what causes the ball to move. The ball that hits the other ball is the cause for that to move, and then there is a chain of physical causes and effects. But Hume says no, we don't actually see effects. We see physical objects, and they're moving around perhaps, maybe they're still, but we actually infer that one thing causes another because cause is an abstract concept. So we project patterns out onto the world that may not be accurate. There may be no such thing as cause and effect altogether. And Hume ends up saying that we create cause and effect out of a mental habit. But we don't even have to go that far. We can recognize that sometimes we make mistakes about causation just because things are correlated together in time and in space. So we say, every time we see A happening, B happens too. So A must cause B. But that isn't necessarily the case. We might be unaware of some other thing, C, that's causing both of them. So he says this kind of argument against causation works for epiphenomenalism too. Just because it's obvious to us that our pain causes physical behavior doesn't mean that that is truly the case. A second objection often given against epiphenomenalism is evolutionary theory. Now, in evolutionary theory, traits that living beings have are supposed to contribute to fitness, which means that you can survive and reproduce. So if we've evolved qualia, or internal sensations of things, it should be useful. And there's no possible way for it to be useful in fitness unless it has causal powers, unless it isn't just a byproduct. But Jackson says that's not the way evolution works. That sometimes there are byproducts, and not every single feature of living creatures is directly connected to fitness. For an example, he gives the coat of a polar bear, because you might have an evolutionary explanation of this as it's a thick, heavy coat because they live in a very cold environment. So that is definitely adaptive. That'll help it survive in an extremely cold environment. But note that I also mentioned it was heavy. That's not adaptive. Heavy things that you have to wear around your entire life will slow you down physically, and being slower is less adaptive in general. So there's actually a name for this in evolutionary biology called a spandrel. It's just a byproduct or a side effect of something that is actually useful for fitness and reproduction. The third and final argument that Jackson deals with to epiphenomenalism is about how we come to know other people have minds. So if you've read a lot of Descartes, you might know that you can be a solipsist and think that you only have proof of your own mind and you never have proof that anybody else has a mind like yours. You might be the only creature in the universe that has a real mind. Everybody else just might be an automaton, a robot, because we can never access the internal experience of their mind. Now, a materialist and a physicalist would say we come to know other creatures have minds through their behavior. We can observe them behaving in the same ways that we do. So if you get your arm too close to a flame, you're in pain, you react, you wince, and you move away from the source of pain. And we can observe other creatures doing that as well, other human beings and other animals. But again, we still have no way of really knowing. They could be the philosophical zombie, in which they have all the same physical machinery as we do, but no internal experience. And Jackson says that the person who's arguing against epiphenomenalism would say that it's a rational inference to think that if they're behaving like me in the presence of the same sort of stimulus, like a pain that's caused by a flame, then it's a rational inference to say their qualia is causing them to behave in the same way as I would. So the feeling of pain makes them move away from that flame, just like it makes me move away from that flame. Thus, qualia need to be causal. And that's how we know other people have minds. But I want you to think back to the diagram from the first lecture, the final diagram, wherein the first physical state causes the second physical state. And they both cause mental states, but the mental states have no causality of their own. And that's what Jackson is doing here when he talks about two newspapers reporting basketball scores. He says that the Spurs have played a game, and he reads about the score of the game in the newspaper he's reading. And from that, he can infer that another newspaper from the same town will have also reported the scores. And he's not assuming that the newspaper reporting that he's reading caused the other newspapers reporting, just that they both have similar, separate underlying causes, and that's the physical. And actually, I think he was American, because I know there are Spurs in the UK, and that would be soccer or football. But either way, obviously, that is not really relevant to the idea that two similar things could have caused separate events and not caused one another. So Frank Jackson puts this article out into the world, Epiphenomenalism, Qualia, and caused a lot of discussion in the philosophy of mind community. And later on, down the line, another philosopher called Paul M Churchland published a rebuttal to Jackson's Epiphenomenal Qualia. And now this is Jackson's rebuttal to that rebuttal. So it's an ongoing conversation about why or why not qualia are important to the mind-body story. Now, Churchland, let me pull up the article, basically attacked Jackson's knowledge argument by saying that these extra colors aren't actually knowledge. They're just a way of sensing physical data about the world. And he did that by giving his own deductive argument, which you can find on page 293. This is Churchland's counter argument to the knowledge argument. 1. Mary knows everything there is to know about brain states and their properties. 2. It's not the case that Mary knows everything there is to know about sensations and their properties. Therefore, by Leibniz's law, 3, sensations and their properties do not equal brain states and their properties. There's some background we might need to know here. Yes, Fred was the thought experiment for the knowledge argument in the previous article, but in the discussion, Jackson tried to clarify his knowledge argument a little bit more by bringing up a new thought experiment, Mary the super scientist. And we think about this future amazing scientist living and being born and raised and taught in a room or a suite of rooms or a bunker, whatever, that has nothing colorful in it at all. So Mary never sees anything but black and white and shades of gray. And perhaps her skin tone, but that actually throws a little bit of a wrench into the works. But let's say for now, all she ever experiences is black and white. But she's such a super scientist that she learns all physical things. Just like this Laplacian demon, she knows every single physical thing that there is to know about the universe and the physical world and physical bodies. When it comes to color, she knows how the light comes from the sun and reflects or refracts or gets absorbed into objects. But then one day she's let out of her bunker and she sees color for the first time. A rose, I think it was the specific example. And Jackson says she learned a fact about the world, where in Churchland says she just learns how someone senses the world, and that is not a true or false fact that can count as physical knowledge. Jackson gives his own proposed deductive argument, saying that Churchland's deductive argument was wrong. This is also on page 293. He says, 1 prime. Mary before her release knows everything physical there is to know about other people. 2. Mary before her release does not know everything there is to know about other people because she learned something on her release. Therefore, 3 prime. There are truths about other people and herself which escape the physicalist story. So you might disagree with him, but he's saying that there's a difference between personally experiencing something or imagining it and the state of affairs where you don't even know that other people experience something. So Mary inside the bunker didn't even know that people outside saw red as red or smelled roses as roses. She only knew the configuration of all the atoms and how they interacted with one another. That insofar as when she went outside and she saw red, she learned something that people had been experiencing the entire time that she had no access to through physical study. And that's why physicalism is not 100% right, at least for Jackson. And he defends that it's the idea that it's knowledge, and knowledge is about the world, and that's why it needs to be physical in a physicalist story. So she didn't know about other people's experiences, and she was missing some giant subset of knowledge about what it's like. So in that way, it's a little bit similar to Nagel, perhaps. It's not about, says Jackson, the capacity to imagine things. There are a couple other minor details that we don't have to worry too much about. The big takeaway for us from this short addendum or rebuttal is Jackson's defense that there's actual real knowledge about the world that the physicalist misses. And that is that there's some component to experience that is different to the organization of physical matter. So Jackson is an emergentist, and he is, again, an epiphenomenal. I should not have said he's an emergentist. I do not want to redo the entire lecture. He's a supervenience theorist. I had emergence on my mind because that's what we're going to speak about in our third and final video. As always, please email me with questions.